Um, Thanks all for kind of coming along this evening and joining the session. So, as Terry said, I'm Natalie. I am based in Sport Wales or Swansea University. I work for as a researcher for the Welsh Institute of Performance Science, and for the past 3 to 4 years now, all of my work has been around how I can support female athletes, and specifically when we consider the menstrual cycle. So what aspects of the menstrual cycle can we consider? How can we help support females with that in mind? I suppose that's really going to be the focus of the session this evening. So really the focus of today, I've kind of tried to split it up a little bit. First of all, just to give some kind of background and experience of when I've worked and when I've spoken to female athletes as to what their perceptions of the menstrual cycle are. We'll go through a bit of a menstrual cycle 101, so just some facts and information around that. It might be completely familiar to all of you, and just a recap, but it might also be new information. We'll then start looking at that in relation to Boccia and considerations specific to the sport, specifically for training and performance, and really looking at how we can apply that in practice. And finally, just to the last part, we'll be touching on kind of having conversations. So I just always want to put this in, especially when we talk about the menstrual cycle, of what today will and might do. So what today won't, unfortunately, there are no definitive answers around the menstrual cycle and training. There's just not been enough research, been enough work done for us to be able to say at different phases of the menstrual cycle, complete X and Y training. We also, there's no way within this session today I'm going to cover everything relating to the menstrual cycle and training performance, but hopefully it'll be a really good starting point for us. And then finally, there's not going to be one solution that we're going to be able to apply to all females. But hopefully what I might be able to do today is provide some insight to female athletes, their experiences of training with the menstrual cycle, give some ideas and examples, and provoke some thoughts and questions relating to coaching female boccia players. And for me, what's really important is a lot of the information might be quite generic, and what I want to do with your assistance and kind of in combination with you is to think about how we'll apply that. So you're the experts in boccia, you're the experts of, you know, what happens within matches, what that looks like. And hopefully together we'll be able to kind of have some discussions and talk through that. Just noticed okay, that's all sorted. I saw there was a couple of things in the chat, but Terry's got that all sorted. So just to let you know, what I've done throughout this session is if that question mark appears on the slide, that's going to be an opportunity when I want us to talk, share, ask some questions, have a chat and a discussion about the different aspects of the menstrual cycle and boccia. So first of all, just to get started, this always helps give me an idea of kind of who I'm talking to and kind of get an idea of what, you know, the comfort really. So if I was to ask you this question now, how comfortable are you talking about the menstrual cycle, from avoiding the conversation completely to extremely comfortable? How would you all rate yourselves? You should be able to annotate on the screen if you want to mark on there, or just pop it in the chat, or feel free to unmute and talk, which would be lovely.
I would say
there's a chance I haven't enabled annotations that way.
That's fine then. We'll do chat or just talking.
Yeah, you can't do the annotate function.
That's no problem at all. Let's just go for chat. Put it in the chat box or just unmute and we'll have a chat.
I probably wouldn't be that comfortable. I think it depends on who I'm talking to be honest.
Thanks, Caroline. Does anyone else have like a similar thoughts of that, or also fairly comfortable, so maybe somewhere in the middle? again, how well you know the person?
I think I'm quite comfortable, having had to talk about it fairly frequently with children and adults as a teacher and as a coach. So I think I'm probably, and also because I'm very old, that you don't mind talking about things.
Thanks, Heather. Anybody else? Terry, am I allowed to put you on the spot and ask you how comfortable you would be?
Yeah. Again, it does depend maybe who I'm talking to or what it's in relation to, but I'm not afraid to talk about it. But my knowledge of it probably would let me down, and yeah, that helps.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely amazing.
Probably this end of the. Am I going the right way? The left side of the question mark somewhere.
Yeah, perfect. So everyone's really different within their kind of comfort of having conversations, and we've kind of said a few things around dependent on knowledge, dependent on how well you know the person, are kind of key things that have come out from that. And one of the reasons I kind of start with that is also to consider actually what the female athletes are feeling like. So to be aware of actually, for some people, they really still are not comfortable. There's still kind of a embarrassment or a secrecy associated with the menstrual cycle. So again, I think it was Heather, you mentioned about age. That's one thing that I've found kind of really familiar, that the older the athlete, the potentially more comfortable they are talking about their menstrual cycle, whereas some of the younger ones are less comfortable, had less experience talking about it, don't really know how to approach it. So these are some of the things, direct quotes that I've taken when I've asked female athletes, like, how comfortable are you talking to your coach about your menstrual cycle? And you can see it's really varied. If it's affecting me and it was affecting performance, I'd talk about it. But then you've got the opposite end there of, I wouldn't say anything, I don't want to because it's too awkward. The one consideration is still around males, so females still feel less comfortable talking to male coaches, worried that they don't really get it. And obviously we've mentioned that aspect of age, so that one there is, I think when I was younger it would have been a more awkward, but not so much now. So just kind of, for me, that's one thing to highlight, is even if we're all comfortable talking about the menstrual cycle, you might have athletes that aren't. And so one thing I talk about towards the end is actually how you can start that conversation and take responsibility for bringing that conversation up. And these are some things that female athletes have said, how they feel at different times of their menstrual cycle. And this is more of the negative impact it has on their training performance. So the classic one that I always like to put up, I'd rather eat chocolate and watch TV on the sofa. There's a paranoia of leaking, and that's a distraction and another thing to manage. And then also the time before my period impacts training performance. So it's actually the time before having the period and bleeding that's having more of an effect on their training performance. I've put a question mark there just to kind of sense from everyone today, are these things that are familiar? Have you seen this with the athletes that you're supporting or coaching? Or is it something that you haven't really discussed at all with anyone that you're working with?
Maybe I'll just do the talking as usual. I've only ever come across one athlete who would, always be that, our parents would think, what's the time of the month? She's not in good form. But unfortunately, there's a communication problem with the athlete as well. So it's very difficult to ascertain how she is actually feeling in herself.
Okay. And have you, obviously I don't know the athlete, and that's where kind of having these conversations are great with you to find out, actually, are there different ways that you'd be able to find, communicate that? So could it be through images of just like pointing to say, Are they happy today? Are they not happy today? You know, what level of communication would you be able to have around that?
I leave it up to Terry. Sorry, Terry.
Well, I was just going to say, before Caroline started, I think in my experience, I don't know whether it's because I'm a meal coach, but I think most athletes just tend to tell me they're not feeling well, as opposed to actually telling me my period's coming up or whatever's going on. So, yeah.
That's definitely so common. And I find it really interesting that a lot of people would prefer to say they're feeling unwell or they've got a bad stomach than to say they're on their period. So that's something that is so familiar, especially again with younger athletes.
I think it's how you're brought up, but to be honest, when I was younger, it was a very poo-poo subject. It just wasn't discussed in our household. So maybe it's to do with the way you've been brought up as well. You know, if your parents have made it, that it's okay, it's life. You know, I mean, if I've been told, look, it happens, it's life, you know, get on with it, you know, just deal with it and talk about it. Maybe I would find it more comfortable to talk to young people about it.
That's definitely one big aspect still, is the kind of perception within society that is something that is secretive and that we don't talk about. And I suppose that's still sometimes reinforced now. And it's kind of a starting point of how we can help support younger people to be able to not have those perceptions and actually are supported so they know it's okay to talk about it and have an opportunity to talk about it. I've seen that Colleen's put in the chat that sometimes pre and post by about 4 days seem weaker, less able to concentrate and more prone to seizures. Definitely the one would be interesting to talk around concentration, because that's a really common symptom of the menstrual cycles. So I'll talk about a bit more about that as well, and pick up how that affects. But has anybody else got any comments before I move on that one? Okay, so kind of linking from what we've just said, is one of the key things for me to highlight from the start is, and this is for as coaches and support staff with female athletes, is to really emphasize that periods are perfectly normal. It's a biological process controlled by hormones. So just as we would talk about other biological, physiological aspects, we might talk about breathing rate, we might talk about heart rate, we might talk about how strong or how weak we're feeling. They're all influenced by hormones, and periods are exactly the same. And it's really trying to put that different light and perception of what periods are when we're discussing it. So just to get started, these are, and again, these might be completely familiar to everyone, and just to recap, but the menstrual cycle, as I've said, is a biological process. It's not just having a period, it's a repeating pattern where hormones fluctuate. It's going to be very individual for each female. So they will have their own unique experience of their menstrual cycle. And that's why at the start I said there's not one answer that fits all females, because everyone's going to be unique and respond differently. A typical cycle ranges from 21 to 35 days, although in adolescence that might be up to 40 days. So the first couple of years of having a period, that can still be a little bit more irregular. Day one of a menstrual cycle is characterized by the bleed. So that's when you start your period. And on average, females start their period around 12. Generally, the range is from 8 to 15. So that's kind of just making sure we've all got kind of the kind of initial knowledge and baseline. It might be new for some of you, but it might just be a quick recap. This is what it looks like if we were to put that on a diagram. So you've got the 4 different phases that we can split the menstrual cycle into. Day 1, this is when you have a period. And at that phase, you've got these 2 lines. So the orange line is estrogen and the blue line is progesterone. And they're the 2 predominant hormones involved in the menstrual cycle. So during this early follicular phase, when we have a period, both hormones are kind of at their lowest point. We then move into this late follicular phase and you get a peak in estrogen, and that's what causes ovulation, so the release of an egg. After that, that's when we get this move into the luteal phase, and we have both an increase in progesterone and a second spike in estrogen. Before the late luteal phase, if pregnancy hasn't occurred, we get a decline in both estrogen and progesterone. And it's these different hormones that cause different symptoms across the menstrual cycle. But as I've said, everyone is completely individual and will experience different symptoms relating to the menstrual cycle. And that's because you might have different levels of estrogen, progesterone, and different sensitivities and different ranges in how much it increases and how much it decreases. So one of the reasons I've put this up is just really linked actually to, I can't remember who said it about concentration, sorry. But the reason it can also affect mood, concentration, coordination, spatial awareness, decision-making, is because those two hormones, estrogen and progesterone, actually interact with the brain, which is hypothalamus and the pituitary. And it actually releases two different hormones from the brain that causes those different fluctuations within the reproductive system. So that's why it can actually have quite an effect on various different psychological, behavioural symptoms, as well as provide physical symptoms.
Can I ask, when do the menstrual cycle, when does it usually finish? You know, what you said between 12 and 15 they start. When do they finish?
That does vary, but kind of, I suppose your life cycle goes into when you're going into perimenopause. That can be anything as early as age 40. On average, it's about age 50 that you start going into menopause or perimenopause. But during perimenopause, that's when we also don't have that nice pattern of fluctuating hormones anymore. You start seeing peaks and troughs all over the place. There's no consistency, no pattern until you come to the end of when your periods stop. Okay, question mark up on this one, symptoms. What sort of symptoms are you aware of associated with the menstrual cycle? We've already mentioned concentration. I'm feeling weaker. Are there any other symptoms that are kind of you've noticed with females or even experienced yourself that you're aware of in relation to the menstrual cycle?
Extreme cramps.
Yeah, stomach cramps, mood swings. I'm just looking at some that are being put in the chat as well. Irritable bowels, sorry, I can't get my words out. That's really, really common. But both from experiencing things like diarrhea, but also the opposite. At different phases, you might experience constipation, coordination, sleep. Sleep's really, really common and can be affected to have more kind of interrupted or not as good quality of sleep. So feeling like you're waking up more during the night, especially in that premenstrual phase. Headaches and migraines, again, they're also really common in that premenstrual phase. Any others? Okay, these are all of the common negative symptoms that are normally associated with the menstrual cycle. So we mentioned abdominal pain or stomach cramps, headaches, bloating's really, really common. Another really common one is fatigue and tiredness in the premenstrual phase. We mentioned, I've kind of classified it there as GI disturbance, so gastrointestinal disturbance, so changes in bowel, changes in mood, so feeling more irritable and more agitated, reduced motivation, reduced coordination. There are so many different ones, trouble sleeping, worry and anxiety, feeling more distracted or more emotional, So there's a lot of different symptoms that might be experienced. Some individuals might experience one symptom, others might experience the majority of those symptoms. And again, that's completely individual, and how they interact with the different levels of hormones, as well as some external factors that can cause symptoms to be worse, such as things like stress, poor sleep, poor diet. They're probably the three kind of most common ones that can actually make symptoms worse as well. As I've just said, I've jumped ahead of myself, but there's so many different causes of symptoms. I've kind of put that list more there to be aware of reasons why we have different symptoms. It's a neuroendocrine response, so hormones are interacting with the brain, which is what can cause a lot of symptoms. Variations in estrogen levels or insufficient progesterone levels. One thing that can cause especially stomach cramps, is that was the first symptom that came up, is that's actually an inflammatory response that produce something called prostaglandins are produced, and that's what causes cramps. And again, things like stress and diet can make those much worse, and therefore have much more painful periods, and kind of cause other symptoms, like stress can cause other symptoms, especially mood, to be much worse as well. So although at the start I kind of mentioned some of what a regular menstrual cycle should be, it's also really important to understand and have an awareness of what is considered irregular. So having no period at all, or what we call amenorrhea, that would be classed as irregular. Infrequent periods, so cycles once kind of individuals are past the adolescent stage, cycles that last more than 40 days, that would be classed as infrequent. But also the flip side of that is if you're having really frequent periods, so sometimes individuals will have cycles that are less than 21 days, so they might have a period kind of every 15, 16 days, so every kind of 2 weeks. But there's also other things that can be classed as atypical. So things to be aware of, like really debilitating stomach cramps that are not eased by like over-the-counter pain relief. That's not normal, and it's not something that individuals have to manage. Really heavy bleeding requiring changing every hour or using 2 menstrual products. And also really severe changes in mood or increased anxiety and depression. So for all of those things, we always suggest seeking medical advice, because they're not typical signs and symptoms of the menstrual cycle. I've put some additional considerations. I was kind of talking to Terry about the athletes that you might be working with, and just had some additional considerations. And again, this is where you've kind of got the experience and expertise with the athletes you're working with, but looked into actually that CP can cause an early onset of puberty and therefore periods to be starting earlier. And also kind of I've kind of talked quite a bit already around how it interacts with the brain. So different injuries associated with the brain can also affect period regularity. So it's just things to be aware of, and for me it'd be really interesting to understand if that's anything that you've experienced or you'd maybe already have been aware of. I'm going to take silence as no, which is absolutely fine. It's just things that I was really just trying to look into and add some extra considerations or factors to be aware of in relation to the menstrual cycle. So specifically, I've tried to think about, again, identify what specific symptoms of the menstrual cycle might really affect Boccia and the kind of demands of the sport. These are some of the symptoms that I came up with. So kind of how it affects spatial awareness, Motivation. So I mentioned that we can have individuals might have lower motivation, how it affects coordination, concentration and focus. So a big one, especially around performance, around staying focused to kind of make good decisions. Sleep disturbance and the effect that might have on performance. Again, that kind of concentration, decision-making aspect. Fatigue, so the length of kind of, again, time that you might have to be involved at competition. Headaches, and actually the one thing I haven't put on here is bleeding, and actually how that could be a distraction, kind of worrying about managing that, timings, how long you might be competing for, and whether you feel like you need to change and managing that. I'm just gonna, so is there anything else, I've put some of those up there from what I've discussed so far that immediately springs out that you've noticed or you would find helpful to discuss in more detail?
I think the big one would be the irritability. That's what I've noticed, that people get quite not necessarily bad tempered, but they quick tempered.
Okay, so it affects kind of that mood.
Yeah, like a mood swing inspection.
Yeah. And how does that affect, have you noticed how that affects kind of performance or kind of actually when they're taking part in the sport?
I think their performance actually goes down. They're not as sharp as what they should be. Their concentration level has gone right down.
Yeah. And again, that's really typical of the kind of the association with those hormones, especially when they're dropping off. So in that luteal phase, when we've got progesterone and then that progesterone starts dropping, that can really affect. I sometimes say it's like you feel a bit foggy, you've not got much clarity, and that focus really kind of drops down. So decisions, taking in multiple pieces of information can feel more difficult. And that's all linked with the changes in hormones.
I'd never really thought about the spatial awareness, because that's quite a big one in Boccia, and I'd never even, thought, could that affect, so it'll be interesting in Boccia if we actually looked at one or two athletes and did it have a marked impact.
Yeah.
Has anyone else kind of experienced that or kind of been aware of that, or is that completely new to them? I mean, one of the kind of examples I normally give with spatial awareness is we know that generally females find it harder to park a car at certain times of their menstrual cycle because of their spatial awareness and how far away and distances things are. Again, not everyone, but some individuals definitely experience that more than others. And that was one thing that I thought of with Boccia, as to the different demands and just the nature of it as to how that would be affected, and just something to be aware of to see if you do find that is affected. And if so, one thing I tried to really as a management strategy for that is practice when you are specifically in that phase of where the maybe spatial awareness isn't as good, so they can get used to actually managing that and finding different ways of overcoming that change in spatial awareness.
And I know some athletes with CP would generally have issues around spatial awareness as well. So I don't know, is that magnified or is that maybe nearly negated with female athletes in Boccia? I don't know. And I know not every Boccia athlete has CP. So again, it's not an overall thing. But yeah, you're definitely right now. Like, it does explains taking.
Yeah, I'm going to be honest, I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, no, sorry. I got distracted there.
I know it's okay. But it's definitely, again,
yeah,
as I said, every individual will kind of respond differently. So it's worthwhile kind of having awareness of that and kind of working with the individuals to see if it is affected more certain times more than others.
Mhm.
Just seeing that Colleen said all of them really. It explains taking out the door frames. So yeah, that kind of spatial awareness. Also, kind of just being a bit more clumsy comes into that as well, I suppose. But definitely, one thing I want to pick up on there straight away is tracking it. So actually track the menstrual cycle and then see, if there is a pattern with when that, in that example, taking out the door frames is more common. So then you can see if it does relate to the menstrual cycle. And then obviously you've then got an awareness of, and can start to think about how you might manage that or what you can put in place to kind of be aware.
Are you going to mention something? Because when I used to coach swimming, there was a big debate amongst the athletes about whether they should think about altering it by some sort of, external means, their menstrual cycle. Are you going to come on to that?
I'm not going to cover anything about hormonal contraceptives today. Purely just going to focus on a natural cycle, but I'm more than happy to answer that question anyway. For me, there are options for hormonal contraception, and if that is kind of the best option for the individual athlete, then obviously I wouldn't say don't use it. But I also think there are so many other options that we could try first to try and reduce symptoms, manage those symptoms before going to use hormonal contraception. If obviously it's really affecting performance, it's causing a lot of anxiety or worry, then sometimes that can be, a really good option to use. But there are definitely other options of managing symptoms that mean that doesn't have to be the go-to response for individuals.
Yeah, because many of the symptoms are either, if as teenage girls, it can be down to other things as well, So I think your point about tracking is a really good one, because also for teenage girls, or as people get older, they can be, it's not just your menstrual cycle that can influence it. And that's always the thing that I have with the menstrual cycle. There's always so many other things that play. Cause and effect is very difficult, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously I've mentioned like stress, diet, sleep, all of those things can have such an effect on the menstrual cycle, but also those things can also cause a lot of symptoms that are very similar to the menstrual cycle. So that's why by tracking it, and I normally try and advise to track for at least 3 cycles, so you can see if there's a pattern with those. So for example, if symptoms, so like irritability, low motivation are occurring the week after a period, then that's not a menstrual cycle symptom. That would be a symptom that's being caused by what I'm going to call life stress or activities. Whereas if there's a common pattern over the 3 cycles of coordination being affected at the same time over 3 cycles, then it's easier to establish that that's being caused by hormones in the menstrual cycle rather than any other factors. And when you're also tracking it, try to take note if there are particularly stressful events, if there's a lot of other stresses going on, if you've had really bad sleep because of other external factors to the menstrual cycle. So just if there's really key points, if there's a stressful time at work or an exam at school or any other factors like that, to track those as well, because they might be causing symptoms to be worse, or ones that actually aren't related to the menstrual cycle. So going back to this list of all different symptoms I put up, are there any other symptoms on here that I didn't cover that you think would really affect Boccia and the athletes that you work with? Okay, I'm going to go for no, but if anything pops up again, just unmute, ask any questions, and we can, jump backwards. We don't have to stick to the order of what I've put together today. Really interesting, increased sensitivity to noise. Does that almost cause like any effect, like thinking about now moving on to training performance? What impact does that have, and at what point is that increased sensitivity to noise experienced? And again, it might be, especially thinking about in relation to training performance, trying to track if there's a particular time that happens. So again, we can then put in a management strategy for that at the particular times. So then it isn't something that is a distraction or causes it to be like something that's causing distress. Oh, sorry, I've just seen that you've responded and says it becomes distressing. So again, and then becomes something that causes a distraction in losing focus. So it'd be really good to track when that is, so then potentially what time of a menstrual cycle that occurs, so then you can put in a kind of management strategy for that, if that helps. And again, that actually, if I kind of show you what I've done here, this is how I'd maybe start tracking symptoms. So based on different phases of the menstrual cycle, you might have different symptoms. So for example, in this early follicular phase, bleeding, obviously there's the period there, pain, but also a positive symptom that there's really good coordination at this time and really good focus during this time. So again, it's really important when you're tracking to identify not just the negative things, but actually the things that are really positive and are beneficial for training and performance. So then you can actually look at, what is the best it can be, and therefore what can we do, to see the difference between the two. So if you then look at the next phase, when you get this peak in estrogen, it's actually a time when individuals feel really confident, have increased energy, and are really motivated. You might see that actually at this time, like on task, really focused, want to do really well, they're feeling really confident, and that's when potentially they might be at their best, and therefore it's how we can kind of maximize that. So you can kind of know actually at what point they're going to potentially perform at their best, and therefore that's what we want to try and achieve in all the other phases as well, by putting in different management strategies. When we start getting into this mid-luteal phase, that's actually when we get some of the kind of more negative symptoms. So I've kind of put there poor coordination, less risk-taking, and spatial awareness. That's commonly when those symptoms are experienced. So just after ovulation, which is about midway through a cycle normally, that's when you start experiencing those symptoms. And then finally, within the late luteal phase, the premenstrual phase, that's normally associated with headaches, which can be really distracting. It's actually the rapid decline in hormones that causes headaches and the withdrawal for those hormone levels. Fatigue, so feeling more tired, being more irritable, so it might be affecting behavior a bit more, focus, be a bit more distracted. Sleep disturbance is really common, which obviously makes irritability and fatigue even more heightened. So really trying to manage sleep is important during this phase, and that's through simple things like having a dark room, reducing noise, making sure temperature is not too hot in the bedroom, relaxing in the evening. So with that, things like reducing the light so that it's dimmer, that helps kind of increase that feeling of sleepiness. And decrease motivation. So actually, how can we support the females that we're working with to help them be more motivated? So that might be a time where, as coaches and support staff, we really have to help motivate to perform, to train to be at their best. So question for back to you now again. Think about how might low motivation, fatigue and reduced coordination affect performance within Boccia? Would that, for you, would you think that would have a negative impact on performance? And if so, is there anything you can think of that you might do to overcome that?
Probably make sure then you don't have too hard a training session if it's fatigue during these times. So if you actually then begin to map out that you might be doing more tactics or something rather than a hard physical session if to lose it, and just recognize if there's low motivation, you might have to externally motivate. If they're normally quite motivated individuals internally, then you might have to use some external factors, whatever they may be. So say some competition, I don't know. And the reduced coordination is maybe then do something that that they're not going to fail at because of the poor coordination. So you find other tasks to do.
Yeah, perfect, Heather. And that also, for me, links really well that obviously if they've got a task they are going to keep failing at and they've already got low motivation, then obviously it can really cause that motivation to be even lower because they're not feeling like they're succeeding. So adjusting what sort of training you're doing could be really important. It is a good time to practice kind of tactics and skills so that if you are in a competition in this phase, they're still confident because they know they're able to perform at that time. But it is definitely linked with being aware of tiredness, fatigue levels, and how that interacts again with what they might be able to achieve and succeed at in training. Great idea from Nicole is having short breaks in training. So just maybe splitting it up a little bit more, having a bit more recovery time, so then they are able to complete the training that you've kind of prescribed.
And I think what you're saying there, Natalie, about what was it? Making sure that they're still where we can, we're still training, getting them to do those things because we don't have any control over where a competition's going to fall on that individual's cycle sort of thing. So I know some of this is another coach this morning actually about some people's response is just, I'll not train this week. But then if you never train during that, then you can't avoid that with competition usually. So, but yeah, I think there is a balance there, getting that right, that it's pitched at the right level. I think he actually had a falling out with an athlete because she didn't want to train and he made her, and which doesn't work either. So it's how we manage that, I suppose.
Yeah, that's when having those conversations is really important because, again, it's managing the balance, isn't it? So it might be if they're more fatigued, then you can still complete it, but we might need more breaks, as someone has said, or actually more fatigue, so we need to reduce what type of training, but have a focus on tactics and skills. For me, it's not about just completely going, well, we won't train at that time, because as you said, competition still will take place. But also for me, it's how do we prevent those symptoms from having an impact in the first place? So Heather, exactly as you said, if someone's got low motivation, what can we do externally to change that so that they have got higher motivation? What can we put in place? How can we support those athletes so they are able to overcome that? So fatigue, is that making sure that we're having a bit more recovery? What does sleep look like? What does food intake look like to help recover or fuel in the first place? So actually being able to fuel the sessions so that they're not feeling as tired. So there's lots of different options, but for me, it's really thinking about what the symptoms are, and therefore what could we actually do to support to overcome that, rather than just go, well, we'll just not train at that time. Any other thoughts or input on that? I'm definitely a keen believer that females should be able to perform at any day of their menstrual cycle. We just need to be aware of the symptoms, work with them, and potentially be a bit more proactive and planned to overcome it. So, for example, if we know you're going to have stomach cramps, okay, once we've tracked, we know kind of what a regular cycle might look like, and therefore can maybe predict a bit better as to when a period's going to come, and therefore what days you might have stomach cramps, and therefore what do we need to have in place so it doesn't affect, especially if that's going to fall on a competition day. Okay, so here's some of the kind of prevention and management strategies that I would generally advise, but again, this is when kind of your experience, your knowledge of the athletes you're working with will info what is possible, and also what would work, what wouldn't work. As I've said, and I know I keep repeating it, but for me, one of the first things is monitoring and tracking the cycle to really help understand and plan. A healthy, balanced diet can really reduce symptoms. When I say that, fruit and veg can reduce inflammation, so they're anti-inflammatory, whereas processed foods are pro-inflammatory, so they actually cause increased inflammation and can make symptoms much worse, especially things like stomach cramps. So again, trying to have a really healthy, balanced diet can really try and reduce some of those symptoms that are experienced. Managing stress, I kind of put, whether that's life, training, school, work, that kind of really reduces the severity of symptoms and the number of symptoms experienced. Sleep and recovery, how can we maximize those two things? So obviously I mentioned a few things around the sleep environment, so nice and dark, no noise, temperature, getting into a nice routine. And again, period pain, what can we do to manage that? So things like a hot water bottle, it does make a difference, or like a heat patch that you can stick on. If over-the-counter pain relief can be taken, so obviously that depends on different medical conditions always. Again, being proactive of taking ibuprofen, like an anti-inflammatory, can really reduce severity of menstrual cramps and period pains. But obviously, in order to be able to do that and be proactive to take them, we need to track to know when that might occur. So normally, if you can try and take ibuprofen maybe the day before or just as cramps start, that can really reduce the inflammation and the severity of the pain. Has anyone got any questions about that, or any other ideas around different prevention and management for different symptoms? Like from your own experience, is there anything you found works really well?
I think eating and ibuprofen work well.
Yeah. As in what sense of eating?
Eating healthfully, not rubbish.
Yeah. More and more information is now becoming available of how having like a healthy, balanced diet really does reduce the severity of symptoms. We know things like alcohol can make it much worse, symptoms much worse. Processed foods are definitely a key one. So just trying to really have a healthy, balanced diet can make such a big difference.
I must admit, I'd never thought about taking ibuprofen. It's only if you know when your period is coming, your menstrual cycle's coming.
Yeah.
for some athletes think it's so irregular, but I've never thought about taking the day before. You know, usually when it starts, everyone feels that initial stomach cramp and takes something, but I think it's interesting thinking about taking the day before.
Yeah, so that's almost like a preventative approach of, you know, if you do have a regular cycle, so you roughly know when that's going to start, and you do, especially around competition time, that's more when I'd suggest doing that. So if there's you've got an idea of when your period might be coming, and if that coincides with competition, actually taking an ibuprofen the day before to reduce that inflammation can reduce the severity of the pain.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've kind of tried to split those prevention management into just some considerations for training and competition, which hopefully will be useful in practice. So in training, determine symptoms, implement different management strategies, and practice skills at different times for the cycle ready for competition. So as I said, performing at the best in any phase. Whereas competition is about being planned. So what phase of the menstrual cycle will competition be in? Have you planned ahead to manage things like bleeding with the length of competition, including call rooms? So there are things that might just add an anxiety or a worry or a distraction that might affect performance on the day. And also what helps increase things like concentration, energy, and mood, so that individuals are always able to perform. So as a coach or supporting a female, what could you do to really help make sure that they feel able to concentrate, they feel they've got good energy? Again, energy for me relates always to sleep, recovery, and what food you're eating. You know, you can really change energy levels based on those things. So actually, how can you prepare for that, ready for competition? One of the key things, though, throughout all of this is to talk about it. So if you don't know what symptoms are experienced, then obviously there's nothing you can do in training, there's nothing you can do at competition to support. So really having these conversations is really key. I've put a question mark there because I'd be interested to know if anyone already has conversations with those that they're coaching and supporting. Yeah, does anyone already have conversations?
I suppose sorry, somebody else talking there. No. Okay. I suppose I've only ever had conversations when it's prevented somebody from training or somebody's had to leave training. Not so much around how do we prevent and manage it. So that's maybe something that we can use those opportunities for, as opposed to, and I think it happened. We had, I think, 3 or 4 sessions that were nearly exactly 4 weeks apart there, and it happened to just totally sink one of our athletes. So, which we normally wouldn't see that just as regularly. If the training was 5 weeks or 6 weeks apart, it maybe just wouldn't sink just as much. But yeah, so it probably is just something for myself. I need to get better at doing that bit of planning with athletes. We do think about how do we start to relieve those symptoms a bit or prevent them a bit.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the, and hopefully today will really help with that, is even having, starting off with having an awareness of that now. And then what we're going on to now around just talking and having conversations, even if you have that conversation and the individual experiences no symptoms, it doesn't affect them at all, it's not something that you then need to think about or consider, but at least you then know that and you've eliminated that as being something that's not going to negatively affect performance. And also, providing the opportunity to talk about so many other factors that might affect training and performance. So to get to the stage where the menstrual cycle is just one of the things that we check in on, is really kind of what hopefully to aim towards. Does anybody else talk to, obviously Caroline, I saw that you were shaking your head.
Good no.
Does anybody else talk to anyone that they're supporting or coaching?
I think what this is doing is making us realise we should be talking to them.
So I think I had like a slight overlap then between two people talking, and I didn't really catch what.
I'm just saying, by being here tonight, it's made me realise that perhaps we should be talking to them.
There's no, it sounds silly, but there's no reason not to.
Yeah.
Even if it's, as I said, that initial just conversation of asking, does it affect them at all? They might not be aware of whether it does yet or not, and that's really common. I had so many different females that I've worked with that go, no, it doesn't affect me, I just change my training or don't go training when I start my period. I can sit there and go, well, it is affecting you then if you can't train when you start your period. So again, it just starts that conversation, and then you're able to identify as a coach how you then can support that and kind of work with that as part of the programming and planning that you do.
Just around tracking, Natalie, is there anything, like, obviously you can probably just do whatever you want, but like pen and paper, or is there apps, or is there, I don't know, what would be what have you found works for that? Or
there are loads of different options, and I always say it needs to be whatever either you or the individual is actually going to complete. So if it's someone that is happy using their phones and using an app, and that works best for them, then there's loads of different apps. Clue's really good. That's like a really nice basic app to use, where you can put in the first day of your menstrual cycle, and you can kind of tap on different images to say if you've got any other symptoms. Flow's another one, but even things like on like a phone on Apple, there's kind of like Apple House, which you're able to track the menstrual cycle on. But likewise, if an app isn't the best option for you, or you just won't get on with that, or the individual won't get on with that, then marking it in a training diary, writing it down on a piece of paper, there's different ways of doing it, but the main thing is what works. And key things are to track when you've got your first period, so then you know if you're having a regular menstrual cycle and how long that cycle might be, and to write down any symptoms that you're kind of feeling or retrospectively felt last week. So especially when you first start tracking, sometimes you don't realise that you actually were a bit moodier or a bit tired, and then your period comes and go, oh, that's why I felt really rubbish last week. So especially to start off with, it might be useful to track how you retrospectively as well. So yeah, they're kind of like different options of what to use. Fit a Woman app is another one that's got a lot of information on about the menstrual cycle, different food to have at different times, how it might affect training at different times, which can be really useful. But I just know that some people also find that really overwhelming. There's a lot going on there. So it depends how much you kind of what you want from the apps. But they're the main ones I'd recommend. This is an example of, once you've had a conversation, you've been tracking, of how you might go about completing this for an individual. So this is an example of an athlete I've worked with and all the different symptoms they experience. So for example, day one, symptoms are much worse. Stomach cramps are at their worst on day one. So what medication, pain relief can we put in place to make sure that doesn't affect on competition? this individual had loads and loads of injuries at this time. And that was the effect of estrogen on tendon laxity. So joints become more lax when you've got high estrogen. So again, how can we minimize injury risk at that time? Others, really common symptoms that were identified were lack of motivation. So actually then it was like, right, okay, what can the coach do to try and really support and increase motivation at that time? Was much more clumsy, it had food cravings. So again, how, what does a diet look like? What can we make sure we're doing? Protein intake, for example, to reduce some of those cravings associated more with sugar and processed foods that we know cause symptoms to be way worse, but that's normally the ones that are being craved. Feeling bloated, and again, different kind of food cravings. So this is how you might, after tracking for 3 months, this is how I mapped everything. And then I can start thinking about, okay, what do I need to put in place? How can I support that individual? What can we do to manage that? So especially when it comes to competition, it's not going to have a negative impact whenever competition falls. And really, this is like the important bit relating to talking, is some ideas of how you might start a conversation. Okay, so that might be considering starting off by thinking about what message you want to share. So that might be one example might be you've attended this session this evening. It's made you think about different things related to the menstrual cycle, and you want to ask if you've ever noticed if your symptoms affect you in training or performance. So that might be your clear message that you want to ask. Another one might be you've noticed that for the last 3 months you've really been struggling to train at a similar time, and therefore wanted to ask if that's related to your menstrual cycle. So again, real clear message. You can then kind of provide some evidence. So just things that we've spoken about today. So you're aware that symptoms can be experienced at different times, such as stomach cramps or reduced coordination or impact on spatial awareness. So share that you're aware of that and asking if that affects. And then number 3 is always, for me, that one of the really important things is to listen to what that individual's experience is. Said at the start, everyone's experience is different, and therefore there's no one solution to fit everyone. And also the strategies you put in place probably won't be the same across everyone. There might be some very close similarities. So really listen, and then together think about what actions you need to be put in place. How can you support each other in order to be able to reduce how the menstrual cycle might be negatively affecting. But also, obviously, I mentioned it, that follicular phase. There's some really positive symptoms like increased confidence, lots of energy, increased motivation. How can you also make sure that we're really taking advantage of those times? And again, having that conversation allows that to happen. It might be to start off with that you start the conversation by saying, actually, you think it would be really useful if we tracked the menstrual cycle in relation to training and performance. And from there, you're then able to later on, once you've kind of started tracking those symptoms, have a bit more of an in-depth conversation. But be aware that, obviously, we said at the start, not everyone's comfortable. So the other person might feel really awkward. So again, be supportive, be encouraging, be aware that different levels of confidence, how familiar they are with you, their age might also really affect the comfort and openness of conversations. Terry, unfortunately, is the only male in this session tonight. Be aware that there is still a perception that males lack knowledge, even though I've found with my work that males and females equally have the same amount of, whether that's a lot or little, knowledge. That is a perception that because males don't experience it themselves, that they just don't understand. So again, you might have to just do a little bit of work around actually sharing, you understand that you might experience these symptoms, let me know if you do. And again, having that conversation, you can then say, allows me to be able to support you if you do experience that. And one of the biggest things affecting openness and comfort is the opportunity to actually talk about it. So provide those opportunities to have the conversations. As I said, it might be one that comes back and says it doesn't affect them at all, and therefore no further, real in-depth conversation is needed. But you've kind of allowed that opportunity for the individual to discuss it if they need to. And these are just some kind of final, I suppose, top tips from me, really, when I'm talking about having conversations. Really try and talk without using euphemisms. So there are so many different words to describe the menstrual cycle and periods, which sometimes can be helpful, but I tend to find that individuals also, if you're not comfortable by saying menstrual cycle and periods, they then are worried that you're feeling awkward or embarrassed. So actually really trying to use those words can be really helpful. Help create a supportive environment. So avoid displaying feelings of awkwardness. And what other support systems are in place? Is that younger and older pairs? Is that someone that maybe they're more comfortable with, that you can engage in that conversation so that they might feel more open and comfortable in order to discuss the menstrual cycle? I've said it loads already, so I won't repeat myself, but try and track symptoms to increase awareness, and then also think about management. And then finally, one thing I haven't mentioned actually or spoke much about tonight is menstrual products. There are obviously loads of different menstrual products, but the one thing for me is making sure that there's access to them at training and competition. So we know that it can be a real distraction and a worry. So try and reduce some of that by actually, especially if they're irregular, knowing that there's access to menstrual products, so that can be easily solved. There's no worry about leaking, bleeding, and just having that support to be able to manage that. Has anyone got any questions around any of those four kind of key points I've put up there? No. Okay, really then just to summarize, and then that hopefully gives us if we want to, I wanted to make sure there was kind of a little bit of time towards the end just to ask any questions or have any discussions. But really to summarize, kind of female athletes do report that training and competition is affected by their menstrual cycle. So it's definitely something to consider. The menstrual cycle is not just a period, it's fluctuating hormones that result in different experiences and symptoms. Specifically with Boccia, there's different symptoms that might affect determinants of performance. So we've mentioned spatial awareness, motivation, coordination, fatigue, a whole host of different factors to consider. In relation to training performance, those symptoms might influence both training and performance. So actually, what management strategies can be put in place? How can you support individuals so it doesn't have a negative effect, so that they're able to perform at any day on their cycle? And finally, conversation. So try and take responsibility for a conversation, creating a supportive environment, and really try and help improve that self-awareness so they're able to work with rather than against a menstrual cycle. And they're just I'm going to leave that slide up if there's any questions, just to think about really the environment that you're in, increasing awareness and increasing education, are kind of three key things that all come together that can actually make a real difference around this topic area. Okay, I'm going to stop waffling on it, all of you now, and kind of ask, is there any questions that anyone's got or any specifics that I will try my best to answer? And if not, I'm always happy to go away do a little bit of research and get back to you.
So not really a question. I just wanted to say thanks for that, Natalie. So we bit of context. This Natalie did a workshop for Sport and I think it was about a year ago now, Natalie, and sort of a bit more general sport. So that was partly why I thought this would be good for the online learning, because it has, and I think we have addressed a few things that are a bit more specific for Boccia, which is brilliant. And I think there is, I know my discussions in Natalie did sort of say, and maybe I'm totally not right with this, but I think it's just something that isn't really discussed a lot in Boccia training or Boccia practice. And I don't know whether that's we're not comfortable with it or we're not aware of it, or we just think there are bigger issues. But I think looking at this, there's definitely a few things I think I can bring in and start to have those conversations. So
I would agree with you there, Terry. I mean, I never really thought about it, but now that I've sat here tonight, it has brought an awful lot of things to light. And maybe we should have a girls' session, have a split a group and have all the girls give a chance for them to have a little chat and try to get a bit of information from them or pass a bit of information to them, let them know we're there, we do care about them, we can do our best for them.
And I know Boccia UK and all the home nations are doing quite a bit of work at the minute about promoting and encouraging more girls and women into Boccia. So I think it's definitely something we can look at about more of an education piece, I think, with athletes. So I don't know what people's thoughts on that are. Do you think athletes don't want to talk about it, or just don't think, either they don't think it's important or they don't feel they can talk about it? I don't know if anyone else's thoughts on that, and I'm just throwing stuff out there because
I think if you were given the opportunity, they probably would talk about it. It's just that we haven't given them the opportunity.
Yeah.
And that's like a really good starting point. Does that make sense? Of, hopefully everyone tonight has just increased maybe awareness or given, even if it's just from all of what I've talked about, there's just one thing that's given you like food for thought that you can kind of take away and apply within your practice and within your coaching. Again, that's a starting point, and also increasing that awareness and how you could then maybe just provide the opportunity to even ask about the menstrual cycle with those that you're coaching. Might be a good starting point if that's not currently done already. And hopefully if you are already having conversations, I've hopefully given a bit of information that you're actually able to kind of expand on and build upon. But as I said, I'm more than happy for you to pass on my email, Terry, to everyone that's attended.
Sure.
So if any questions come up after tonight, potentially I have delivered quite a lot, so lots of information to take in and take on board. But if any questions come up, please always feel free to get in touch.
And I think that's a really good point,
Thank you very much.
Pauline, actually, about, I think some athletes might be surprised that, why is it there's some days I turn up and I just can't do that shot, and it might be because it's regularly at a certain stage. I think there might be a bit there to sort of stand. I think that just comes through the education. If we're a bit more open with players about that, and then they can make that link that it's not just, and like there are some players if they have a bad day like that might be a whole week's worth of training just won't happen just because they're in a bad mood. So whereas if they can attribute it to that might be something
it's
can work with more.
Something that I found really helps. I've definitely experienced and worked with a lot of females that it's almost like a frustration. They're like, why can I not do this? Why am I not performing? Or why am I having such a bad day? And actually, once they've then tracked their cycle and they're aware of what phase they're in, they kind of go, okay, this is why I'm feeling like that. This is what I can do about it, rather than just getting frustrated and annoyed of not being able to understand. So again, that's a really, really good point that I hadn't kind of covered, but is important to bring up.